Nikolai Sergeyevich Petrov. His father was a genius nuclear physicist who took the lead in developing nuclear weapons for the Soviet Union against the United States during the Cold War. Professor Petrov, like his father, followed the path of a nuclear physicist, but his work was completely different. Now the Cold War is over and the Soviet Union is disbanded. There is no longer a need to develop nuclear weapons that will no longer be used. But in the energy sector, nuclear power is still useful. Except for radioactivity and nuclear waste, nuclear power is cheaper and more efficient than other power plants. Professor Mohan said while drinking beer. Professor Petrov is developing a traveling wave reactor. We are a pioneer in that field. I just saw it through foreknowledge, but I just admired it as if I didn't know it. Ah, traveling wave reactors. I see. Do you know what it is? I don't know much about liberal arts, but roughly. I remember seeing it in this paper and article recently. Any skill will evolve over time. First built in the 1950s, nuclear power plants have evolved several times over the course of more than half a century. The traveling wave reactor is a next-generation nuclear power plant technology that dramatically improves the problems of current nuclear power plants. Existing nuclear reactors require periodic replacement of nuclear fuel and maintenance of cooling systems to prevent meltdown. Mistakes in this process can lead to terrible accidents. Most of the nuclear accidents that have occurred so far are due to human error, not natural disasters. However, traveling wave reactors can operate uninterrupted for more than 50 years once refueled. Since no human manipulation is involved, the chance of mistakes is significantly reduced. Because it is cooled with liquid metal rather than coolant, the reactor pressure is also lower than 100 times, so there is little possibility of explosion or core melting. By burning more than 99% of the fuel bundle, radioactive waste is also reduced and the creation of nuclear weapons from waste fuel can be prevented. If Professor Petrov succeeds in the traveling wave reactor experiment, as predicted, the path to a safer and more efficient nuclear power plant will be opened. How valuable is this technology? Money is money, but until a new technology such as nuclear fusion energy is developed, it may be possible to dramatically improve the energy problem. Either way, you'll need to see Professor Petrov to get things going. I asked gently. What are you meeting for? It's a meeting with friends. Professor Petrov had visited Caltech several times before. We've been interacting with each other since then, but it's been a while since we've seen each other because we're busy. By the way, Professor Petrov also said that he has some spare time, so I think I will take this opportunity to meet him. A nuclear physicist who develops nuclear power technology and a geologist who studies earthquakes. I wonder if these two are related, but in reality they are closely related. This is because safety is the most important consideration in nuclear power technology. After the Fukushima nuclear accident, awareness of nuclear power plants increased, and seismic design was further strengthened. What would people think if I suddenly made contact with a Russian nuclear physicist I had no connection with and offered to invest? Of course you will be puzzled. However, if there is Professor Mohan in the middle, it is a different story. You can pursue a very natural encounter. Can I come with you? Professor Mohan looked surprised at my words. You too. I have a little interest in that these days. Are you talking about the reactor? Even if I didn't say anything, Taekyu patted my shoulder and said, apparently noticing the situation. Of course. We are paying great attention to the energy business these days. Let's take this opportunity to visit Russia as well. After thinking for a moment, Professor Mohan nodded his head. Well, since we're meeting in person anyway, it doesn't really matter. I'll have to talk to Professor Petrov first, though. I'd like to ask you a favor. Ellie, who was having a conversation with Yuri at another seat, returned to our seat. She noticed that she had been drinking some alcohol, her face reddened and her eyes were slightly opened. Where are you going? Russia. What happened? I briefly explained the situation. Then Ellie spoke like a grumpy. What? I also wanted to go to Russia. Then shall we go together? Is that okay? Sure. Ellie quickly ran to the table where Hyunja's older sister was. She then returned as she drooped her shoulders after a while. Hey, Jessica won't even dream. It's very busy these days. As I comfort her, Ellie narrows her eyes. Aren't you going to visit Russian beauties? Ugh. Ellie quickly turned into an angry expression. I'm really going to get mad at you. I burst out laughing. Hey, I can't do that. Don't worry, I won't see another woman. Really? You won't turn your head when a very pretty Russian girl passes by next to you, right? Of course. If you don't do it, the human heart makes you want to do it more. After I promise not to see you, I suddenly want to see you. There are so many beauties in Russia. Thinking so, I could feel Ellie staring at me with a cold gaze. I'll ask take you everything later. I'll pretend I don't see it as much as I can and take a peek at it. Or did you put take you under a lockdown? Take you said confidently from the side. Hey, that's why you can't have a lover. I'll have to look at it openly. I said in a passing tone. We reach Min Ha-young Hannah and Princess Enrique. After the meeting he returned home. Eli was drunk or not washed and she fell asleep. In the meantime I went to the living room and chatted quietly with Take-You. You mean that Russian professor succeeds in conducting a traveling wave reactor experiment? The proliferation of electric vehicles is inevitably linked to energy problems. If this problem is not solved, it may be unreasonable for electric vehicles to completely replace internal combustion engine vehicles. So there was a talk at one time that hydrogen cars would become the mainstream. Nikola's founder Alan Eberhardt invested in a solar power company called Solarland to solve this problem, and later merged it with Nikola. Solarland's main product is the solar roof. The plan is to build a solar roof that can be installed on the roof of a house to charge electric vehicles and secure the energy needed at home. There may be limitations in non-detached houses, but it is definitely a good idea. I did some more research. Nuclear power technology is not only related to energy but also to nuclear weapons. Therefore, countries with nuclear reactors can develop nuclear weapons if they want to. And to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, there are international regulations such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT), and the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) turns on its eyes and monitors it. However, this does not apply to the permanent members of the Security Council, which already possess nuclear weapons. To use an analogy, large organizations armed with heavy weapons are restricting firearms in order to prevent neighborhood bastards from shooting. It is meaningless to argue whether this is right or wrong. The international order, as it was before and now, is driven by the logic of power. And it is also true that doing this rather than developing nuclear weapons will help maintain world order. Anyway, unlike other countries that are heavily regulated, the US, China and Russia are free to test nuclear weapons. Therefore, research on nuclear power technology has been actively conducted. The United States is at the forefront in this field. In particular, in the case of megapower, it has come to the experimental stage for commercialization. Although the United States is not particularly sanctioned by international organizations for its nuclear tests, the government's regulations are severe. The fear of radiation is the same for Americans, so if you do an experiment in your own country, the public won't like it either. So Megapower was going to work with a Chinese company to test a nuclear reactor in China. However, before the experiment, a problem arose. What problem? The US-China trade war broke out. Nuclear-related technologies in any country have the highest security level. If joint experiments are conducted in China, there will be no law prohibiting Chinese companies from copying the technology. For national security reasons, Ronald halted joint development with Chinese companies and nuclear reactor tests in China. What? Then it was because of you. What? It would have nothing to do with it. It has already been approved by the Chinese government. If the trade dispute had been delayed for just 1 month, it would have entered the experiment. While the US and China were working to develop a traveling wave reactor, Russia was not idle either. I don't know how it is compared to the US, but Russia's nuclear power technology is also world-class. First of all, it has a long history of technological development. It has been developing nuclear power since the Soviet era and took the lead in the commercialization and operation of nuclear power plants. Traveling wave reactors are also known to have already been significantly developed. As experiments in the US and China have been suspended, it is a good opportunity for Russian researchers to outsmart their competitors. However, research in Russia has also been halted. Why? This is also because of the circumstances of adults. The current economic situation in Russia is difficult to say with empty words. The biggest problem is falling oil prices. Oil prices have risen due to the damage of Big One and the North Sea oil fields, but it is not comparable to the days of high oil prices. The US still excites shale oil and shale gas and sells them around the world, bringing down oil prices. In 2014, the Crimean Peninsula conflict broke out. After Russia devoured Ukraine's territory of Crimea, the Western world was subjected to strong economic sanctions. As a result, the ruble plummeted and the economy suffered great difficulties. Moreover, the Crimean Peninsula crisis, which was hoped to be settled, has now spread to eastern Ukraine, causing frequent military clashes. In this situation, the possibility of success is uncertain, and the nuclear reactor experiment, which costs a lot of money, has been pushed back from the priority list. You might have expected that there would be technical difficulties with the US and China halting the experiment. Thanks to you, we have a great opportunity. Taeyong nodded his head. At this point, it's time to do something with the brown bears. Professor Mohan cancelled the plane ticket he had originally booked, and decided to travel together on our private plane after the Korean tour was over. Joining Professor Mohan and Carrie, we flew straight to Russia. Carrie is fine, she didn't know what to do. It's a private plane. Can I take a picture to show off to my friends? Of course. Take pictures as much as you like and show off as much as you want. In Korea, the weather is slowly getting warmer, but Russia is still in the middle of winter. So I brought enough winter clothes. Flight time to Moscow is about 9 hours. While the plane was moving, I skimmed through Russian conversation books. Unlike English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, which are derived from Latin, Russia uses the Cyrillic script for the Slavic family. Since the language system is completely different, reading and pronunciation is usually not difficult. In the end, I memorized a few greetings and closed the book. Taekyu was muttering "Tsubasaiba" for nothing. When he arrived at the airport, an interpreter and security guard were waiting. Golden Gate, a global financial company, also has a presence in Russia and has dispatched English and Russian-speaking employees. Read more at wuxiax.com. Nice to meet you, Mr. Kong. This is Angelina Rudakova. She was a tall, white-skinned Slavic beauty with blonde hair and blue eyes. Taekyu put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Come to Ellie." Already? I haven't even seen it properly yet. We immediately got into the prepared car and headed to Moscow University. The first Moscow University I visited was large and beautiful. Taekyu said with admiration, "I can feel the spirit of the great Marshal of Steel. Oh, Comrade Stalin. This is not wrong. In fact, these buildings are called Stalinian, and there are 7 of them in Moscow." Professor Petrov was meeting outside the school. Professor Mohan, who had been reunited after a long time, greeted him warmly. Looking at the photos, I thought he had a good physique, but when I met him, he was more than that. The height is over 190 centimeters. He was blonde and had a rough beard, and his broad shoulders and steel forearms seemed to be able to beat a bear with his bare hands. Taekyu asked in a low voice, "Do you have to build that much muscle to become a nuclear physicist?" "No way. It's not like you're running around carrying fuel rods yourself." Fortunately, Professor Petrov spoke English. "I heard you were coming with me. Nice to meet you like this. This is Nikolai Petrov. Nice to meet you. This is Jinhu Kong." We shook hands lightly. "Let's go inside." It soon became known that Kong Jin, who had gone to Russia with Professor Mohan. This is his first trip to Russia. He moved not only the head of OTK company, but also the vice president. Naturally, attention is drawn to the purpose of his visit. The Kremlin, where the Russian president's office is located, closely watched Kong Jinhu's movements. President Vysotsky received frequent reports. "I am currently moving to Moscow University. We will arrive in 30 minutes to meet with Professor Petrov." "For what purpose did you come here? Are you trying to look around the situation in Russia with the excuse of accompanying Professor Mohan? He is recognized as the richest man in the world. He owns companies that have the technology to move the global economy, not just the money. It is also an old saying that Russia was the leader of the Communist Federation. Now wealthy capitalists are welcome with open arms. With tensions rising with NATO allies and groaning from Western sanctions, if OTK company invests in Russia, the economy will be refreshed." President Vysotsky gave the order. "You don't know what's going to happen, so let's cancel everything except for important events." We were able to tour the lab under the guidance of Professor Petrov. The way the researchers sat in front of the computer and worked was no different from other labs. Well, I'm not going to do experiments with uranium or nuclear fuel rods in the university, so this is natural. Progressing wave reactor development is a national project. It is known that Professor Petrov's research team is receiving support from the Rosatom as well as national support. Taekyu asked in a low voice. What is Rosatom doing? Russian nuclear power plant. Just as Korea has KNP, Russia has Rosatom. Although the same in that it builds, maintains and manages nuclear power plants, Rosatom also develops and produces nuclear weapons. Russia is operating a total of 11 nuclear power plants in its own country and is also actively exporting nuclear power plants abroad. After looking around the area where outsiders were allowed to tour, we sat down. Do you like tea or coffee? I have coffee. Is there no Coke? The researcher served drinks. Sorry for the sudden visit. I don't know if you're surprised. Professor Petrov burst out laughing as cool as his size. Haha, I'm sorry. I also wanted to meet you once if I had a chance. When I heard that Professor Mohan was coming with me, I struggled to hold back what I wanted to brag about. The two professors who had not met in a long time exchanged stories. Professor Mohan was initially negative about nuclear power, but he said that he changed his mind little by little after talking with Professor Petrov. The reason the two developed a personal friendship was because they shared a common understanding of the climate change awakened. I am still negative about nuclear power. It is not enough to say that once an accident occurs, the damage is terrible. But if we can't get rid of nuclear power plants on the planet right now, it would be better to find a safer and more efficient way. Professor Petrov said. At present, nuclear power is the energy with the lowest environmental impact. Thermal power generation emits huge amounts of fine dust and greenhouse gases. It is the main culprit of environmental destruction along with automobile exhaust. Germany, which declared that it would phase out nuclear power, increased the ratio of eco-friendly energy, but at the same time, it ran full operation of coal power plants using lignite as fuel, causing environmental destruction. In the end, what came out as an alternative was LNG power generation. To this end, Russia is constructing a gas pipeline to import natural gas. I remembered my conversation with Professor Haman Kim. While Professor Haman Kim is researching how to efficiently use renewable energy through an energy storage system (ESS), Professor Petrov is researching how to use nuclear power more safely and efficiently. He felt great again. While most people live their daily lives, someone is trying to make the world a better place. Humanity could have come this far because of people like this in any era. Can I get a more detailed explanation? Are you talking about TWR? Yes. I am interested in that these days. Most scholars are proud of their field of study. Again, Professor Petrov was excited and explained the outline and advantages of a traveling wave reactor. As you know, nuclear power has a lot of problems. Human error can lead to catastrophic catastrophes such as the Chernobyl and Fukushima nuclear disasters. But TWR can solve most of the problems with nuclear power plants today. A traveling wave reactor starts from a fast breeder reactor. The concept first appeared in the USSR in 1958. My father was a scientist who developed nuclear weapons. Waste fuel from nuclear reactors was used as a material for nuclear weapons. A fast breeder reactor can reburn waste fuel from a nuclear reactor. Petrov's father and Soviet scientists thought that the fast breeder could deter the development of nuclear weapons while simultaneously disposing of waste. It didn't get much attention at the time for a number of reasons, but things are different now. This is because the shortage of uranium supply, the storage of spent fuel, and the prevention of the proliferation of nuclear weapons have become global issues. This was followed by an explanation of the principle and outline of the traveling wave reactor. Even if we heard it anyway, we didn't know what he was saying, so we just nodded eagerly. The principle is unknown, but the advantages are clear. Nuclear power plants are built along the coast. This is because of the characteristics of light water reactors that require a large amount of cooling water. In coastal areas, it can be cooled as much as possible using seawater. Korea is mainly concentrated on the east coast. However, in a traveling wave reactor, the fission reaction proceeds slowly and is cooled with liquid metal. As there is no need for a separate cooling water, it can be built inland. Another advantage is that it is easier to miniaturize and modularize compared to light or heavy water reactors. It can be built one at a time where small-scale power generation is required, and can be mounted on large ships or submarines. In fact, most of the problems of existing nuclear power plants can be solved. I asked gently, if the experiment is successful, when will commercialization be possible? Professor Petrov said confidently, If the experiment is successful, it can be commercialized within a year. It is different from existing nuclear power plants that require large-scale facilities, so construction time and costs can be greatly reduced. But then he shook his head. The problem, one way or the other, is completely all stopped at this stage. We are accumulating data through simulations, but we do not know when the experiment will be possible. Is it because of the budget too? That is probably the biggest reason. The reactor experiment is not about making only a twinkle atom. All kinds of facilities and safety devices should be made in preparation for the Bay 1. You have to convince the people around you too, but Russia is so vast and the government is strong, so you don't have to worry too much about that. The cost of testing and commercialization is approximately $1 billion. A plan that may or may not succeed right away is a large amount to invest in. But if you're 100% sure of success, that's a ridiculously cheap price. Then if we solve the money problem, we can proceed with the experiment. Professor Mohan said jokingly. Are you thinking of making an investment? I nodded. Yes. I will invest. They were both surprised by my words. Are you going to invest? Why so suddenly? Of course it's because I saw the foreknowledge, but I can't say it as it is. Taekyu clenched his fists and said. Why? I strongly sympathized with the two people's opinions that climate change should be prevented. This is a groundbreaking technology to protect the environment. If only we could slow global warming, would money matter? I added quickly. Yeah, that's right. Climate change is a problem for all mankind to solve together. I am willing to give it a try. Both professors were thrilled. Professor Petrov said, grabbing my hand. Amazing. You must be thinking about the future of mankind like this. Oh no. It's only because of my personal self-interest, so it's hard to be moved too much. Jin Hukong, secretly to Russia. OTK Company SO's visit to Russia. Meeting Professor Mohan and Professor Petrov at Moscow University. Is it for personal or investment purposes? Jin Hukong, the possibility of meeting with President Vysotsky? Despite the lack of publicity, the fact that we had come to Russia and had contact with Professor Petrov spread all over the world. We got a hostel in Russia and started working right away. Investing in companies and investing in nuclear power technology are completely different. As nuclear power technology is directly related to national security, foreign companies' investment must obtain permission from the Russian government. No matter how much money we pack and carry, it will be over if the government does not allow it. Even if a permit is granted, it has to go through a number of complex administrative procedures. In Korea or Japan, this process would take at least a few months or more than a year, but Russia is a de facto dictatorship. With just one word from President Vysotsky, things will go smoothly. OTK Company has expressed its intention to invest in Rosatom. Investing also requires complicated paperwork, but if you have a lot of money, you don't have to handle everything yourself. The Golden Gate Russian branch moved on our behalf. Investing in nuclear power plants is a sensitive issue for both those receiving and making the investment. OTK Company does not need to report to the Korean government or obtain permission as much as a U.S. corporation. Instead, it went through a review to see if there were any parts that needed approval from the U.S. government. This part was handled by the Korean branch. The legal team screamed at the rush of work. I received a complaint call from the head of the first legal team. What's this? Because of Jinhu, the whole team can't even leave work right now. How did it happen? Is that a lot of work? Is that important now? Why didn't you say anything when you went to invest in a traveling wave reactor? I could have talked to you in advance. I think I was more upset about not telling him ahead of time than the work bomb. Sorry. I didn't know it would be like this either. I was just going to listen to the story, but it was decided suddenly. Is that a lie? Really? How did you know it was a lie? I comforted Ellie for a while. I will buy you a present. Release your anger. Then Ellie's voice softened slightly. It depends on what kind of gift you buy. Do you want to be a matryoshka? Isn't there a more legal problem than that? I've been looking for it now, but there shouldn't be any problems. Megapower's research was halted because of concerns that the U.S. nuclear technology would leak to China. We are investing only capital, not technology, so there will be no legal issues. More than that, Jessica was worried about other issues. Currently, Russia is subject to sanctions from the West. NATO members are pressing for implementation of the Minsk Agreement. Of course, Russia is not even listening. Even if it avoids legal problems, it is a situation where you can see it. Read more at wuxiax.com. If the US allows it, there will be no major problems. Russia was once an enemy of the United States. However, things have changed a bit since the rise of China. The US has revised its foreign strategy to use Russia to contain China. President Ronald also pushed this strategy. So while China is pounding excitedly, it is passive about sanctions against Russia. Also, he was known as a pro-Russian faction even before the presidential election, and had frequent personal meetings with President Vysotsky before the election. As long as it's not against the law, I'm not really against it. What is important is President Vysotsky's intention. The meeting was held in secret at the Kremlin, presided over by the president. Rosatom and Gazprom officials also attended. Although nominally both are privately owned companies, they are effectively operating according to the will of the government like a dictatorship. President Trusova Rosatom said with excitement. It is enough for Rosatom to invest without having to receive investment from OTK company. Jin Hukong has succeeded in all investments so far. His interest meant that the experiment had a high probability of success and commercialization. It's not that Rosatom doesn't have the capital, so he doesn't have to put the OTK company in it. If you receive an investment from OTK company, you can share the risk, but you must also share the profit. The Minister of Energy had a similar view. However, some disagreed. If Jin Hukong decides to invest in this field, he will invest elsewhere even if Russia refuses. Currently, it is known that the US megapower is at the forefront of technology. It is more effective to use his reputation than to rule out Jin Hukong. In a way, wouldn't it mean that Russia's nuclear power technology was recognized? Just holding hands with Jin Hukong will be of great help in winning the nuclear power plant order. After the Fukushima nuclear accident, awareness grew and construction of nuclear power plants around the world stopped for a while. In other words, it can be seen that demand has stagnated. And this demand has been stretching recently. UK, China, Czech Republic, Japan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and so on. There are not one or two countries that have confirmed or are reviewing nuclear power plant construction plans. Russia competed fiercely with other countries to win orders. The largest company in the world in this field is EDF of France. The technology is also the best in the world. China is entering the market with low-priced orders with CNC, China Nuclear Industry Group, and CNP, China Nuclear Power. The plan is to make a name for itself in the global nuclear power plant market by accumulating export performance rather than immediate profits. Korea is also a strong competitor. Korea has been at the forefront of construction in the Middle East since the 1970s, and is knocking on the door of nuclear power plant construction in the Middle East based on the trust it has built up. A typical example is the order for the Baccarat nuclear power plant in the United Arab Emirates. On the other hand, Rosatom is at a disadvantage in many ways due to sanctions from the West. However, if a traveling wave reactor is successfully tested, this situation can be reversed at once. It is an opportunity for Russia to rise to the top of the world in the nuclear power sector. If Russia succeeds, neither the US nor China will stand still. I'll resume the experiment right away and pursue it. But until then, you can definitely hit first. Prime Minister Volkov viewed the situation more objectively as he had experience in the presidency. Jin Hukong is investing in various industries such as self-driving electric vehicles, games and IT. We need to have him participate in this project and strengthen cooperation with OTK company across the industry. This is a great opportunity to revive the stagnant Russian economy. President Vysotsky tapped the table with his fingers as if contemplating. After a while he opened his mouth. Let's meet Jin Hukong once and make a decision. We stayed at a hotel near the US Embassy. This is an American hotel where many American diplomats and businessmen stay. The best thing is that soundproofing and protection against wiretapping are thorough. There is nothing wrong with being careful as Russia has a lot of history in this regard. The hotel overlooks the city of Moscow. I came all the way to Moscow, shouldn't I have to visit the sites? Red Square or St. Basil's Cathedral. 5. Do you know St. Basil's Cathedral? You're from Tetris. It's a pity that I can't go sightseeing, but if I go outside right now, I'll get the media's attention. By now, the Russian government will also be debating whether or not to receive the investment. You know I'm staying in this hotel, so I'll get in touch with you in some way. I stayed at the hotel and reviewed the material. President Vysotsky. The 21st century is the heyday of strong men. President Ronald vowed to make America great again, while Prime Minister Okazaki shouted, "I will make Japan back." And then President Zhang Pinghua declared a great power and the Chinese dream. President Vysotsky also pursued a strong Russia throughout his tenure. Viktor Antonovich Vysotsky. A former member of the KGB, a Russian intelligence agency, he entered politics and was appointed prime minister by President Boris Yeltsin. After Yeltsin resigned as president due to health problems, as we all know, he was famous for drinking and running states, and Prime Minister Vysotsky took over as president. After that, he won the presidential election and started a full-fledged long term in office. However, Russia's constitution forbids a third consecutive presidential term. Contrary to everyone's expectations that he would be re-elected for a third term even if the constitution was amended, Vysotsky stepped back and nominated Volkov, his close aide, as the presidential candidate. Volkov is Vysotsky's loyal dog recognized by others. He was successfully elected president with the support of Vysotsky. Vysotsky briefly stepped down as prime minister. And he ran for president again in the next election. The Russian constitution only forbids 3 consecutive terms, not 3. Vysotsky was again elected president with overwhelming support, and Volkov resigned as prime minister. He was the perfect revolving door greeting. Why do alternative dictatorships vote? It is to gain the legitimacy of domination. German sociologist and philosopher Max Weber explained the legitimacy of domination in 3 ways. Traditional domination, charismatic domination, and rational domination. Traditional domination means hereditary. My father is a king, my grandfather is a king, so I am also a king. In the past, almost all countries were like this. Charismatic domination is when an individual gains power through heroic action. Mao Zedong, founder of the People's Republic of China, and Mustafa Kemal, founder of the Republic of Turkey, are examples of this. Rational rule is a democratic process agreed upon by members of society, just by election. Not necessarily one of the 3, but often 2 or 3 at the same time. Whether a leader with charisma is elected or elected again after his father. The best is, of course, rational domination. Elections conducted by lawful process consolidate the legitimacy of domination. For this reason, the majority of dictatorship countries are going through democratic procedures, at least on the surface. Even the Democratic People's Republic of Korea votes. Here for the 3rd generation they are promoting it as the supreme dignity every day. So even if the people starve to death due to economic collapse, rebellion or revolution will not occur, but that situation will not last long. Whether the domination is justified or not, the most important thing is the economy. As long as the economy grows, even a dictatorship can be overlooked. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union and state bankruptcy, Russia seemed to be on the brink of collapse. However, after Vysotsky took office, Russia revived splendidly. The economic crisis has been overcome and GDP has grown significantly. This is not particularly because of what President Vysotsky did well. It was simply because oil prices continued to rise during his tenure. Although Russia is not a member of OPEC, its economic structure is virtually the same as that of OPEC countries. In other words, it is a typical resource-dependent economy that feeds on oil and natural gas. What stands out, however, is the level of the arms industry. At one time, the Soviet Union was a country in an arms race with the United States, and Russia took over its technological prowess. But this is getting harder and harder. The latest high-tech weapons should be based on the heavy chemical industry and the IT industry. If it is to improve existing weapons, there is bound to be a limit to the creation of advanced weapons in a state where the infrastructure industry is poor. The annexation of Crimea showed Russia's power to the world, but in turn raised the alarm in European countries. After Western sanctions, the ruble plummeted and the economy plunged into recession. The Russian economy is not doing well right now. Although sanctions are decisive from a sober point of view, industrial transformation has failed since then. Comparing with China, the economic record is more clear. During Vysotsky's reign, China grew at a tremendous rate. Whether the government has pushed it, the domestic market is large, or it ignores patents and copies the technology of foreign companies. In any case, dozens of world-class companies such as Witchant, Aligeny and Weihua were born. However, if we have to say that Russia's world-class company then and now, it is Gazprom. As the name suggests, what this company does is sell gas. It's nice to have the resources though. It is not. Oil and natural gas produced in Russia are supplied to all over Europe via oil and gas pipelines. If you shut off the gas pipe valve right away, there are not one or two countries that will be in turmoil. However, in this case it is difficult to implement in practice as Russia will also have to take a huge blow. Well, even in Ukraine right now, even though we are at war with Russia, we can't even touch the Russian gas pipeline that runs through our land. Taeyong nodded his head. If you touch that, you will become enemies with Visit Sukhyung. It's just a complete enemy. There are things in the world you can do and things you can't. Of course, touching the Russian gas pipeline would fall into the latter category. 2 days later, an invitation was sent from the Kremlin. It is said that President Vysotsky wants to meet directly without going through a minister or prime minister. You will meet the President of the United States, the President of China, and then the President of Russia. Where can I go to brag about this? What if I go and drink radioactive tea? Ugh. This doesn't just sound like a joke. President Vysotsky is famous for assassinating his enemies. His most famous case is the assassination of a former agent who fled to England. The cause of death, surprisingly, was radiation poisoning. A large amount of radioactive material polonium was detected in the teacup he was using. Of course, it is impossible for ordinary people to obtain radioactive materials. In the first place, there are views that it is not an assassination but a public execution, in that it was deliberately killed with a radioactive substance that could have been killed with poison. When the assassination took place within the country, Britain was stunned. It is a fact that everyone knows that it is clearly the work of Russia, and that President Vysotsky is behind it. But realistically, there is no way to hold him accountable. Britain charged a bunch of people involved in Russia, but Russia ignored them rather than repatriating them. Britain withdrew diplomats from Russia in protest, and so did Russia. So what happened? Well, that's it. Only the dead were pitiful. I wondered if there was anything wrong with Russia or President Vysotsky. Fortunately, there doesn't seem to be any. I don't think Russia will benefit from giving me radioactive black tea. Rather, Russia has a lot to lose if problems arise. So nothing to worry about. But wouldn't it be better to write a will and go? Isn't that more of a death flag? We got into the car and headed to the Kremlin, where the office of the president is located. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled time, but President Vysotsky said he was 2 hours late due to his schedule. It was already expected, so there was nothing to panic. Hey, wait slowly. President Vysotsky is famous for being late to important meetings. He even makes him wait 30 minutes at the shortest and hours at the longest against the leaders of great powers. He is diplomatically disrespectful, but he never had the guts to say anything against the Russian president. To pass the time, Taekyu came with a bunch of comic books. It's like a cartoon room, so it's good. It's perfect if you only have ramen. Treating the Kremlin like a comic book room? Anyway, I had nothing to do, so I read a comic book next to me. I started reading it without thinking much, but it is fun to read. Isn't this the next volume? It hasn't come out yet. The speed of this author's serialization is insane. If you are tired, post a notice of pause in magazines. I was going to give you an OTK award, but if your serialization looks like this, you should think about it. Where does fair screening go? About an hour later, President Vysotsky is said to have arrived. That being said, he didn't wait that long. Taekyu waved his hand at the aide's words to guide him. I'm telling you to wait a minute. It's an important scene right now, so I'll just watch this. The aide was bewildered and I dragged Taekyu inside. In the drawing room there was a man who had watched him get bored on TV. He smiled and said, "Come here." Half-veiled white hair and angular face, dark eyebrows and blue eyes. Although he was now in his mid-60s, he still had a strong impression. His stature was surprisingly small. He wears high-heeled shoes, but in reality it is unlikely to be less than 170 centimeters. This man is President Vysotsky, who is called the Tsar of the 21st century. He has been, and still is, the president of a huge country called Russia since I was in elementary school. In terms of his tenure alone, it is incomparable to President Ronald, and much longer than that of President Zhang Pinghua. President Vysotsky was not alone. Next to him was an interpreter, and in front of the sofa were 2 dogs. It is none other than his dog. By the way, he is famous as a dog lover. The problem is that the dog is a black Doberman the size of a house. In fact, he is known to carry it with him even when hunting. He had been dragged out to a meeting with the German Chancellor in the past, and the German Chancellor was terrified. It seems that everyone who claims to be a strong man has at least one bad taste. Will it hurt if bitten? Unlike me, who flinched at the thought of that, take you liked it. 5. Cute. What are the dogs' names? Read more at wuxiax.com. Does that also belong to a dog? Can I touch it once? Do what you like. President Vysotsky nodded his head in embarrassment, and Take-You stretched out his hand towards the Doberman as if nothing had happened. They're well trained, but when a dog bites one, then serious things happen. In the end, President Vysotsky sent the dog to another room. We said goodbye and then sat down. Since it was not an official event, the atmosphere was natural. You must have had a hard time coming here, but let's have a cup of tea first. The prepared drink was at least black tea. The black tea in a colorful teacup had an infinitely transparent red color. President Vysotsky poured his own tea. I'll take it easy. It's a tea you can't taste anywhere else. What the heck is it that I can't taste it anywhere else? Did you put a spoonful of special radioactivity from Russia? I am very anxious, but I can't help it. I picked up the teacup with the feeling of drinking a potion. Take-You saw that and said quickly, I'll drink Coke. Coca-Cola, please. A child like this unmade minion? President Vysotsky leaned on his back in a comfortable position and asked questions about my business and Korea. After about 30 minutes of conversation like that, we finally got to the point. I heard that you want to invest in Professor Petrov's research. That's right. President Vysotsky shook his head and said, Russian nuclear power technology is already the best in the world, and it has abundant natural resources. Is there no need to over-experience? Are you not going to allow it easily? I put down the teacup and said, It's not like that. Russia's future depends on it. President Vysotsky expressed interest. Why? The transition to electric vehicles is accelerating in the global automobile market. Russia has a lot of frozen ground, so it could be delayed a bit, but it's only a matter of time. As the proportion of fossil fuels in the world is bound to decrease, Russia must prepare for the future. British economist David Ricardo argued for comparative advantage. The theory is that when one country trades in a product that has a comparative advantage over another, the interests of both countries increase. However, there are problems with this theory. That is, the speed of technology integration varies greatly from product to product. Semiconductor capacity increases exponentially, but no matter how advanced agricultural technology is, banana production increases arithmetically. As the years go by, countries that export semiconductors become advantageous, while countries that export bananas become disadvantaged. The United States and Russia are resource-rich countries with abundant oil and gas. Nevertheless, it is making a name for itself as a nuclear power plant and continues to build nuclear power plants in its own country. Is this just for nuclear weapons? As in the previous story, thermal power and nuclear power have different rates of technology integration. Since thermal power generation only burns fossil fuels such as coal or gas, there are obvious limitations when the technology develops in the future. However, nuclear power has evolved over the generations. If a traveling wave reactor is commercialized, it is possible to increase the power generation efficiency by several orders of magnitude. As waste fuel rods from light and heavy water reactors can be recycled, the fuel cost is virtually zero. In the past, there was a time when OPEC controlled the world economy with oil resources as a weapon. The two oil shocks caused by OPEC wrecked the world economy, but that is now impossible. In the past few decades, technology has advanced remarkably in all fields, and world-class companies have been born in developed and emerging countries. But the countries that sold oil are still selling only oil. Russia's Gazprom is still a global company. But how long will that be? A resource-dependent economy will be hit hard when resource prices fall or resources are depleted. In fact, since the shale revolution in the United States, oil and natural gas prices have continued to decline. In addition, the supply of electric vehicles and the amount of renewable energy generation are rapidly expanding. Energy hegemony is already shifting the other way. If it stays like this, Russia will gradually fall behind on the world stage. President Vysotsky leaned back and crossed his arms. If the development of a traveling wave reactor is necessary, it is enough for Russia to invest on its own. Well, it doesn't matter what you do. The technology to build a traveling wave reactor is not unique to Russia. This is bluffing. Because the foreknowledge I saw was that Professor Perov succeeded in the experiment. But the other party is unaware of this fact. Then why did you come to Russia without visiting there first? The first is because I sympathized with Professor Petrov's vision. The second. With this cooperation as an opportunity, we are thinking of advancing into Russia. OTK company has companies with the best technology in other fields, even if they do not have the technology for nuclear power plants. I would like to cooperate with Russia in various fields, starting with the traveling wave reactor project. In other words, without the cooperation of the traveling wave reactor project, there is no other cooperation. Aren't there any guarantees that an experiment will ever succeed? There is nothing to lose if you fail. But there will be a lot to gain along the way. Anyway, I pay, and the fact that I invested can greatly promote Russian nuclear technology. For Russia, it is a business that has nothing to lose. President Vysotsky's official fortune is only tens of millions of dollars. But in reality, there are rumors that it will be more than $200 billion. Naturally, it was not the wealth he had accumulated through hard saving of his salaries for civil servants, but a solid part in the process of privatizing state-owned enterprises and eradicating oligarchs. It is an open secret that he has shares in Gazprom and Rosatom under the car name. If he succeeds in developing a traveling wave reactor, his assets will also greatly increase. So holding hands with me is good for Russia and for him. So you're probably interested in it. President Vysotsky continued to scan my expression with cold eyes. Do you think Russia needs help? Isn't it true that we are suffering from sanctions? His expression hardened at those words. Russia is not funny enough to succumb to Western sanctions. I know. In fact, sanctions against Russia were completely different from sanctions against Iran or North Korea. No country wants to antagonize a country that has nuclear weapons and ICBMs and has permanent membership. There was a strong sense of intimidation in his eyes and expression. The person in front of me is the leader of Russia. And Russia is a hegemon on par with the United States and China. He can move the huge country of Russia with one finger. That's the power he has. So what is my power? Of course it's money. If it wasn't for the money, I wouldn't have been able to meet you in this place like this. But the ruble decline and job losses. And no one likes inflation. Max Weber explained the legitimacy of domination in 3 ways. However, the most important thing is the economy. No matter how they obtain dominance. No matter how dictator he is, he can't help but care about the economy. No, he should care more about the economy because he's a rather dictator himself. As the economy worsens, people's dissatisfaction increases. Declining approval ratings will inevitably put a burden on long-term rule. President Vysotsky looked at me with a firm expression, and I received those eyes as calmly as possible. Just making eye contact made me feel refreshed. Somebody help me. Thinking so, Taekyu, who had been quiet until now, said, all successful presidents are successful for similar reasons, but failed presidents fail for their own reasons. What are you talking about all of a sudden? But at that moment, President Vysotsky burst into laughter. Pooh ha ha ha. He laughed so loudly that the interpreter standing next to him was astonished. After a while he stopped laughing. Do you like Anna Karenina? A bewildered light flashed on Taekyu's expression. I could read those eyes. Who is that? I had intense eyes. It's a book, it's a book. It's a book. It's clear that this kid didn't read the book and picked up those lines from an anime or something. It seemed that he didn't know what it was, but Taekyu proudly nodded his head. Of course. I like it very much. Who in the world doesn't like Anna Catalina? It's Karenina. Who the hell is Catalina? Thinking it was a pronunciation problem, President Vysotsky did not notice. He nodded his head with a satisfied look. Right. Anna Karenina is a perfect work of art. Anyone who doesn't like it must say that they don't know her life. Taekyu didn't change his expression but kept chirping. Yes. Anna Catalina is life, life is life, and Anna Catalonia is. What else is Catalonia? Is this Barcelona? You are a good friend. The atmosphere suddenly changed to a friendly atmosphere. President Vysotsky asked kindly. Did you two have dinner? I haven't even had lunch yet. Because someone must have made an appointment for lunch and then he himself came late. Ah, I'm sorry about this. We decided to leave the practical discussion to the people in charge, and why not have a drink of vodka while having a meal together? The fact that Kang Jin-woo met President Viktor Vysotsky at the Kremlin quickly spread around the world. Because she didn't even need to get information, the Russian press continued to report it as the main news. The next day, President Vysotsky and Kang Jin-ho signed an MOU in front of a gathering of Russian and foreign correspondents. The scene where the two sat next to each other, signed papers, and then shook hands was broadcast in media all over the world. To cooperate with OTK company in the field of nuclear power in Russia. Jin-ho Kang, meeting with Russian businessmen. OTK company decides to invest in traveling wave reactor experiment. Traveling wave reactor is a next-generation nuclear power plant technology that has improved the problems of existing nuclear power plants. Details are being discussed with Rosatom. What will the impact of Jin-ho's investment on the nuclear power plant industry? There is a word called the OTK effect. A word first used by a Wall Street Journal reporter. It means that the company invested by OTK company achieves great success and has a huge impact on the industry as a whole. Therefore, you can make a profit by watching the investment of OTK company and investing in related companies or industries. In fact, some investment companies have used this strategy. As soon as OTK company's investment was decided, interest in the nuclear power plant industry and traveling wave reactors poured in. Other companies did not stand still. Megapower requested permission from the U.S. government to carry out experiments in the U.S., and Chinese and French nuclear power plant companies also announced that they would develop their own technology or form a consortium. The sparks also bounced off Korea. Controversy arose over the government's nuclear phase-out policy. OTK company's working team and Golden Gate entered into negotiations with the Russian Ministry of Energy and Rosatom. Rosatom created a subsidiary, Rosatom TWR, for the development and commercialization of traveling wave reactors, and OTK company invested $1 billion in it and received a 36% stake. In addition, it was decided to continuously invest funds separately for additional experiments in the future. In other countries, administrative procedures such as site acquisition and environmental evaluation and suppression of protests from residents would take more than a year. But Russia was just a breeze. The TWR development plan was abandoned just before the experimental phase. The infrastructure of the site had already been completed. Even though a formal contract had not yet been signed, the construction of a nuclear reactor for testing began right on the site. Residents protest. Officially, it was considered non-existent. I stayed at the hotel and watched the news. The reaction was different. Russia welcomed it and attributed everything to President Vysotsky's efforts, saying that it had paid off. The United States is closely monitoring the situation, and the EU has expressed concerns about sanctions erosion. Read more at wuxiax.com. Hyunju's older sister continued to keep in touch with the Russian branch and spearheaded negotiations, and Eli handled legal matters with Russian legal experts. I received a call from Chairman Im Jin-young. You have already advanced to Russia. How did it happen? It is good that the market expands, but the political atmosphere is not serious. It is evident that they do not like the Blue House or the ruling party. I am watching the news. Environmental groups opposed to nuclear power rose at once, and the ruling and opposition parties engaged in a brawl, and the National Assembly went into a coma again. Still, I'll get my paycheck little by little. I met Professor Petrov. He is the head of this experiment. He looked exhausted from being called here and there by the government and Rosatom officials. Still, his face was bright. Thanks to that, we can do the TWR experiment. I didn't know if you were really going to invest. The future is up to the professor. Haha, I'll do my best. Professor Petrov said as if recalling. As I said before, my father made nuclear weapons. Some of them were dismantled and used as fuel for nuclear power plants, but some are still stored at military bases. He always said that no matter what, the weapon should not be used. During the Cold War, scientists from the United States and the Soviet Union built various weapons, including nuclear weapons and missiles, according to government orders. But none of them would have wished that the weapons they had built would cost thousands of lives. My father thought that having more nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union would prevent war. I wonder what this means, but it's true. The development of nuclear weapons made mutually assured destruction possible, which was the biggest reason for avoiding all-out war between great powers. And the Cold War ended naturally without a single shot. Another reason is that I thought that the skills I had acquired while developing nuclear weapons would definitely be helpful. You said that one day when peace comes, nuclear weapons will be useless, and then the technology created to kill people will be used for the benefit of mankind. Indeed, It was with such a heart that he created the concept of a fast breeder reactor. Professor Petrov looked at us and said, "A traveling wave reactor has been my father's long-standing dream. I want to make that dream come true." I nodded. "It certainly will be." Professor Mohan and Carrie had plans to return to the United States first. Professor No said as if regretful, "I don't know when I will see you again. Sad for me to part too. Next time I will go to California to play. You are welcome at any time. Shouldn't I give a lecture in front of Caltech students? What to say in front of those geniuses?" We shook hands of farewell. Me and Taekyu stayed in Russia for a few more days, meeting Gazprom and Rosatom officials as well as other businessmen. There are chaebols in Korea, there are oligarchs in Russia. They amassed enormous wealth during the fall of the Soviet Union and the transition from communism to capitalism. After Vysotsky came to power, he purged the oligarchs as if to disband the chaebol. But those who survived the purge by working hand in hand with the regime still exercised great power over the entire Russian economy. As soon as he persuaded President Vysotsky to cooperate with the progressive reactor, a series of requests to meet suddenly began. It feels like the bar of Russia, which had been tightly closed, is loosened at once at the president's words. This can be said to be the advantage of the top-down method. Subsidiaries owned by OTK company have considered entering into Russia. Karas decided to test autonomous driving and battery performance in Russia, and M-Pizza decided to cooperate with a local company to open a branch in Moscow. OTK Games also contacted local game companies. Facit was a company that showed more aggressiveness than others faster than anyone else. Toby said in a very excited voice, "Russia is a country with as much passion for porn as the United States. It is a porn powerhouse that has produced a lot of pornography, and there are many actors with excellent looks and acting skills. In short, it is a porn giant with infinite potential." Facit has been trying to advance into Russia before. However, despite knocking on the door several times in the meantime, the authorities did not get permission. The exact reason was not disclosed, but it is presumed to be for the protection of the country's pornography industry. However, although some conditions were attached, the door suddenly opened. Toby couldn't hide his joy. "Actually, when I was young, I enjoyed Russian porn more than American porn. Thanks to this, I was able to learn simple Russian conversation." "That's right. Is it similar to learning Japanese while watching Japanese AV? Doesn't the CO also like Russian porn? How did you know that?" "No, but who's going to come to that conclusion? We are going to have a meeting with local porn companies soon. You can expect to see what kind of porn they will produce. No, it's up to expectations. I didn't have to dry it. They say they are going to Russia with such enthusiasm, so I have to cheer them on hard." I hung up. Taekyu said with his arms crossed, "It's rude." "What do you mean?" "Suddenly the atmosphere is Russian. As the saying goes, Russia was suddenly on the rise. The ruble, which had plummeted, bottomed out and rebounded. Korean businessmen who read the atmosphere quickly rushed to Russia. Chairman Im Jin-yong cancelled the schedule and flew to Moscow on his private plane. Seosong, Yunsong and CL have already entered Russia for a long time. No matter how difficult the Russian economy is, it is a huge country, so its GDP is comparable to that of Korea. It is also a land of opportunity. When the details were finalized, I met with Rosatom and formally signed the contract. The contract was written in English and Russian. Before leaving Russia, President Vysotsky sent a gift to the hotel. After finishing our schedule, we went back to Korea. When we arrived in Korea, we headed straight to the Golden Gate building. Then as soon as I sat down, I heard a lot of nagging at Hyunju, Nuna and Eli. They both looked exhausted from the heavy workload. Heard that he stayed up all night with the staff for several days because he was reviewing the contract until the very end. Ellie asked Dark Circle as she looked at me with her dark eyes, "Did you buy a present?" I nodded proudly. "I bought it." "Really? What?" Having received the gift, Ellie was delighted and opened her package. But soon his expression turned cold. That's matryoshka." "Yes. It is a special product made by a Russian artisan." "I see. It's cute. It's a gift that even preschoolers will love." "I love it. Of course. Because the heart is what matters." "It's not a look I like at all." I quickly pulled a book out of my bag and held it out. It's just a souvenir and this is a real gift." Receiving it, Ellie paused for a moment. "Maybe you don't like this too?" Thinking so, she exclaimed with joy, Nonsense. Anna Karenina, first edition. How the hell did you get this? What? Received as a gift from President Vysotsky. You can't read it in Russian, but it will be worth it. Isn't that a book that's almost in the Russian Literature Museum? Come to think of it, how did President Vysotsky get this? Did you even rip off what oligarch had in your possession? I love it. Of course. I really like it. How did you know I liked this novel? What? It's not a novel that most people like. Few people will read it all. Thank you, Jinhu. Ellie hugged me and kissed me. Hyunju's older sister said as she drank her coffee. This is work, so if you want to do more, go home. When she heard this, she wanted to go home quickly. So, is it really worth $1 billion investment? Taekyu said on behalf of me, who is still kissing. I don't know yet. You don't know until the experiment succeeds, right? A traveling wave reactor can significantly shorten the construction period compared to existing nuclear power plants. If the experiment is successful, it will be a breeze to commercialize it. Hyunju's older sister pressed her finger to her forehead as if in pain. Suddenly, TWR. It's good technology. Until renewable energy becomes more efficient and other new technologies emerge, we will be able to solve the energy problem. If it succeeds. Anyway, it's not a bad investment. The global demand for nuclear power continues to grow. This is because the demand for electricity is increasing. Currently, there are 417 nuclear power plants in operation worldwide. About 40 countries are considering the construction of nuclear power plants in the future. There are about 500 nuclear power plants under review, of which 150 are under construction. If TWR is developed, it could sweep this market in the future. If this happens, wouldn't Rosatom overtake EDF to become the world's largest energy company? Anyway, with this investment, the Russian economy is reviving. President Vysotsky took care of the economy every day and went directly to the sales of Russian nuclear power plants. He emphasized the fact that he was funded by the OTK company. I don't really like Korea. Did you see the protesters in front of the company when you came? Yes. I already knew it because I heard it on the news, but when I came I felt it. Protests are in full swing in front of the company. This time, environmental groups. They held a protest holding signs with words such as anti-nuclear power plant, abandonment of nuclear material, a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and expansion of new and renewable energy. It also received signatures of support for nuclear power phase-out from citizens passing by. Why are there so many protests in that place? What kind of protest is it? There are countless protesters who have gone through that place so far. I feel sorry for the companies around me. Well, it's good to express your opinion in a democratic society. Greenpeace, the world's largest environmental organization, made an official statement. It is a complete lie that nuclear power is green. OTK company should immediately stop investing in nuclear power plants and start expanding new and renewable energy. Greenpeace hates nuclear power and also hates thermal power. I like renewable energy. Several environmental groups, including Greenpeace, have repeatedly called on governments to increase the amount of solar, wind, and hydropower generation. But this isn't quite as simple as it sounds. Hydroelectric power generation is limited where possible, and solar and wind power generation efficiency is low. In addition to this, various methods such as fermenting grains to obtain ethanol are being discussed, but the economic feasibility is the same. If this had been such a simple problem in the first place, KEPCO would have shut down both thermal and nuclear power plants and went all in on solar and wind power plants. The government is also moving to phase out nuclear power, but it is not yet possible to touch the currently operating nuclear power plant. Hyunju's older sister shook her head. The government must be in a difficult situation now. The elimination of nuclear power was a key promise of President Ha Chong-min, and he has promised several times that he will pursue it unwaveringly. But things have changed a bit since then. Germany, which went out of nuclear power, started to import large amounts of natural gas from Russia, and Taiwan gave up its policy after experiencing the worst blackout, in which 2/3 of the country was cut off. Japan, which announced the dangers of nuclear power to the world due to the Fukushima disaster, is also considering building a new nuclear power plant because it is not enough to restart nuclear power plants. However, South Korea has announced that it will push ahead with nuclear phase-out. According to the government plan, all nuclear power plants in Korea will be shut down in about 50 years. As Korea gave up building a new nuclear power plant, domestic nuclear power companies had to find another breakthrough. Fortunately, orders for nuclear power plants poured in from overseas. The government said it would actively support the export of nuclear power plants, but the prospects were not very good. Nuclear power plants do not end with construction. Once built, it will operate for decades with maintenance in between. However, according to the government's roadmap, in the meantime, Korea will end nuclear phase-out. From the perspective of a country that wants to build a nuclear power plant, there is no choice but to give an additional point to a country that continues to develop the nuclear power plant industry. However, in this situation, OTK company joined hands with Rosatom. The timing wasn't good either. Read more at wuxiax.com. The Czech Republic has decided to build two 1,000 megawatts nuclear power plants in Dukovany and other places. If future maintenance is added, the total project cost is billion. Nuclear power companies around the world competed fiercely to win the order, and the Korean government even stepped in to fight it. Perhaps because of this, Korea was mentioned as the most likely candidate along with France. Czech scholars and government officials decided to visit Korea to see the KHNP and Kori nuclear power plant in person. However, when the news of OTK company's investment became known, the visit to Korea was abruptly cancelled. Instead, they turned to Russia's Kursk nuclear power plant. India, the UK, and Poland, which are pursuing nuclear power plant construction, also showed great interest in Russian nuclear power technology. In fact, it is said that the export of nuclear power plants has crossed the water, and the stock prices of related companies such as KEPCO and Jusan Construction have fallen by more than 10%. Yoon Nak-young, leader of the Liberty Korea Party, launched an attack. Even the world's top investor Jin Hu-kong is investing in nuclear power technology. While the world is making efforts to build nuclear power plants and strengthen nuclear power technology, only Korea has declared abolition of nuclear power. Now that it has become clear that nuclear denuclearization is an impractical fiction, the president should step in, admit that the policy was wrong, bow his head and apologize to the people. On the internet there was a lot of debate. Hey, the Liberal People's Party is on the side of the aftermath. Is Kang Jin-hu left-wing or right-wing? Why are you tackling government policy? If you look at what you've done so far, you're a conservative rightist who pretends to be a leftist only on the outside. Typical fashion leftist, Gangnam leftist. In reality, it is a water polo cone. Nuclear power plants are not environmentally friendly, and there is a risk of radioactive contamination. Nuclear power plants must be abolished. Then is thermal power plant eco-friendly? Do you say those words even when you look at the fine dust? We want to increase renewable energy such as hydropower, wind power and solar power, not thermal power generation. Korea isn't even Norway. How many places can generate hydroelectric power? Should the Hoover Dam be built? If you want to replace one nuclear power plant with solar power, you need to push out the national forest and install a solar panel. Which one is more environmentally friendly? Efficient management of nuclear power plants is possible as they are gathered in one place. For solar and wind power, transmission and wiring must be connected in each area where they are installed, which is not an easy task. They're the ones who only need to blow up a nuclear power plant to get their senses. If nuclear power plants are so bad, why are the US, Russia and France building them like that? Are you saying that in the reports of Chernobyl and Fukushima? The United States and Russia are large in land. Korea is a small country and has a high population density, so if one nuclear power plant goes off, it will be over. If we have to stop construction of new nuclear power plants and stop operating old nuclear power plants, if there is only one nuclear power plant left on the Korean peninsula, isn't it dangerous anyway? Right now, China is saying that it will build an offshore nuclear power plant in the West Sea, but even if Korea abandons nuclear power plants, if it explodes in China, it will be over. On the issue of nuclear phase-out, the opinions of the people were sharply divided. As far as the progressive government is pushing for nuclear phase-out, liberals tended to oppose nuclear power while conservatives favored nuclear power. The Blue House and the ruling party were in trouble. It is up to the investor to decide where to invest. However, it is nuclear power generation, not other industries. If it had been another entrepreneur, he would have consulted closely with the government before making the investment. However, Jin Hu-kong continued his work and did not even notify the government. The Korean government even recognized the fact that Jin Hu-kong had contact with Professor Perlov at Moscow University and with President Vysotsky at the Kremlin after seeing the announcement from the Russian side. To be honest, as OTK company is an American company, it doesn't matter where or how Korea invests, but the CEO himself is strictly Korean. Although it could not keep pace with the government policy, it was not good for planting because it invested in the opposite industry.